Look at this rock. Stunning, isn't it?
A girl like you couldn't even dream of this.
To titles and husbands who buy us real estate, while you stand here at my engagement party in a polyester apron. At what point do you realize you've been left behind? They mocked her for her silence, laughing at her uniform and her stagnant life as she served champagne with a single tear tracing a path through her foundation. What happened next silenced the entire city of Manhattan. To the wealthy, Zarah was an invisible ghost, but she understood that Manhattan only respects the loud. While Lee DeSome flaunted a 5-carat diamond and Kim Hae-won scanned for her next mark, Zarah remained disciplined. When they sneered that billionaires aren't taxis waiting for a waitress to be ready, Zarah simply knew that choosing a life is better than running to one out of fear. They called her a ghost, never realizing that in the shadows, Kang Min-Jae was preparing to reveal that the woman they mocked was the only one who truly owned the floor she stood on. Welcome to our community. Our stories feature powerful Korean mafia bosses, strong female leads, and intense romantic connections that cross cultures and boundaries. If you love mafia romance, Korean drama vibes, billionaire love stories, this channel is for you. Subscribe for weekly uploads of addictive mafia stories, Korean underworld romance, and dramatic storytelling that will keep you hooked till the end. If you want to see how this story goes, stay with me until the very end. And as we begin, hit that like button and tell me in the comments what you feel about this story. Zarah moved through the penthouse like a shadow, a presence that was felt only in the seamless replenishment of a glass or the silent removal of an empty plate. To the elite gathered under the crystal chandeliers, she was a ghost of Manhattan, a background fixture in a life they believed she could never touch. But Zarah understood a truth they often forgot. Ghosts hear everything. From her vantage point behind the silver tray, she observed the world of the wealthy not with envy, but with the quiet attention of a woman who knew that luxury was often a shroud for loneliness. She watched Kim Hae-won tilt her head in a performative laugh, her eyes remaining as cold and calculating as a ledger. Zarah saw the way Hae-won's hand tightened around her designer clutch whenever her husband moved too far away, a subtle fracture in the mask of the woman who claimed to have it all. Zarah recognized that look. It was the same desperation she had seen in Umuahia, where people chose what others represented rather than the person themselves. These women had built their lives on the shifting sands of status, and Zarah could feel the structural integrity of their joy beginning to groan under the weight of their own fear. In the kitchen, away from the glittering performance, Zarah's life was defined by a different kind of discipline. She didn't spend her meager earnings on the Ankara prints of Manhattan high fashion or the fleeting validation of a social media post. Instead, she invested in her own steady self. She spent her mornings studying, reading by the pale light of her small apartment, and building a foundation that didn't require a man's name to stay upright. She had learned that silence was not a lack of ambition, but a place where real work happened without the distraction of an audience. As she returned to the floor, her gaze briefly met that of Kang Min-Jae. He was a man who occupied space with a solid, unhurried confidence, standing apart from the frantic energy of the social climbers. While the others looked through Zarah, Min-Jae looked at her, not as a servant, but as a person who possessed the rare, dangerous quality of being truly present. Zarah straightened her shoulders, her emotional discipline as ironed as her uniform. The rich believed they were the ones watching the world, but Zarah knew the truth. She was the one who saw the hollow sentences they had yet to finish. Kang Min-Jae sat in the recessed velvet of the VIP section, the amber liquid in his glass catching the strobe of the city lights outside. To the world, he was a man of cold, hyper-controlled power, a king of real estate and deeper, darker allegiances who moved through Manhattan with the quiet confidence of someone who had already said everything worth saying. He watched the performance on the floor below not with the boredom of the elite, but with the focused attention of a man who had spent months observing a single, steady light in a room full of flickering shadows. His gaze remained fixed on Zarah as she moved with a dignity that refused to be diminished by the tray she carried. While the guests around her performed for the room, Zarah existed within it, her presence solid and unhurried. Min-Jae remembered a time, years earlier, when his own world had been a landscape of gray desperation and sharp edges. He had been a man standing at the precipice of losing his humanity, buried under the weight of expectations and the cold calculations of his position. In a moment of vulnerability he had never forgotten, Zarah had intervened, not with a grand gesture, but with the kind of quiet, genuine kindness that the residents of this penthouse would never understand. She had seen him then, truly seen him, when he was just a man and not a monument of wealth. It was that memory, the particular warmth of her steadiness, that had anchored him through the seasons of his own rising shadows. Now, watching her endure the sharp, deliberate strokes of Lee Dasom's mockery, Min-Jae felt a shift inside him that was quieter and more dangerous than anger. He saw the way she cracked the seeds of their cruelty between her fingers and let the silence sit between them without feeling it. He knew what the walls of this room were absorbing, the silences that stretched too long and the sound of doors closed with just slightly too much force. He watched as the women of Manhattan's high society, trapped in their own gilded fears, tried to make Zarah feel unfinished for being unattached. But Min-Jae saw the truth that their expensive lenses missed. He saw a woman who had trusted herself when trusting herself was the harder choice. He set his glass down, the sound lost in the music, and prepared to step out of the shadows. The offer stood, and though Zarah was not in a hurry, Min-Jae was finally ready to build something real with the only real person in the room. The air in the VIP lounge was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the sharper, metallic tang of desperation masked as triumph. Lee Dasom leaned back, her long acrylic nails clicking against her glass with a rhythm that had not stopped since the party began, a sound like a clock counting down someone else's time. She adjusted her silk wrap, her smile reaching her eyes only because she was performing for the audience she intended to impress. Beside her, Kim Hae-won was already applying powder to her face, her eyes scanning the room like a predator casting a net, and casting it wide. "You see, Zarah," Dasom said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that carried the weight of a deliberate stroke. "Success isn't about waiting for a job to save you. It's about a plan. My husband didn't just buy me a car for our introduction. He bought me a future that most people only see on social media." She spoke as if the truth were simply a piece of furniture she was rearranging, ignoring the hollow texture of a piece built on provision alone. Hae-won nodded, her expression reserved and functional. "Love is sweet, but love inside a fine house is sweeter, especially when that house is protected by names people are afraid to speak out loud." They bragged about their marriages as if they were business arrangements, built with the focused energy of a mission rather than a connection. They spoke of their men as taxis, available whenever they decided they were ready to ride into a life of fine things and travel. But underneath the laughter, the walls of the penthouse were already absorbing the performance. Zarah stood still, her silence not a lack of words but a refusal to participate in their fear. She could see the invisible pressure, the careful comparisons dropped like pepper into soup, and the particular ache of women who chose what a man represented over who he actually was. They were casting nets of gold and greed, never realizing that a house built on fear does not refund time. While they mocked her for being slow, Zarah simply watched the slow work of consequence begin to unfold in the silence between their boasts. The air in the penthouse grew heavy, charged with a predatory energy as the greedy friends decided that Zarah's silence was no longer an enigma to be questioned, but a target to be broken. Lee Dasom, fueled by a cocktail of champagne and deep-seated insecurity, signaled to Kim Hae-won with a subtle, sharp tilt of her chin. As Zarah moved past with a fresh tray of crystal flutes, Hae-won's designer heel caught the edge of Zarah's path with calculated precision. The crash was a symphony of violence in a room built for soft jazz. Shattered glass sprayed across the marble floor like diamonds thrown in anger, and the pale liquid soaked into Zarah's uniform. The impact forced her to her knees, her palms pressing into the cold, wet stone as she tried to stabilize herself amidst the wreckage. For a moment, the room went silent, but it was not the silence of concern. It was the collective breath of a crowd waiting for the performance to reach its climax. "Oh, Zarah, look at the mess you've made," Dasom exclaimed, her voice ringing out with a theatrical, jagged delight. "I suppose when you spend your life standing still, your legs eventually forget how to carry you." She leaned over, her 5-carat diamond shimmering inches from Zarah's face, a cruel comparison dropped like pepper into soup. "This is what we meant. You're stagnant. While we are building empires, you are literally on the floor, cleaning up after the people you used to call friends." The laughter that followed was the loudest of the evening, a short, broken sound that carried the weight of years of judgment. They mocked her for her lack of a plan, her ringless finger, and the slow nature of a life that had no Instagram angles to hide behind. Zarah remained on her knees, her head bowed as she gathered the shards of glass with bleeding fingers. She could feel the pressure, thin and invisible like the air before a storm, pressing against her chest. But as she looked down at the reflections in the spilled champagne, she didn't feel the shame they were trying to drown her in. She felt the deep, settled satisfaction of a woman who knew that a foundation built on fear would always eventually crack. From the corner of her eye, she saw a pair of polished black shoes stop at the edge of the glass. Kang Min-Jae was no longer watching from the shadows. The breaking point had arrived, but it wasn't Zarah who was about to shatter. The silence that followed the crash of glass was heavy, a thick and invisible pressure that seemed to stop the very air in the penthouse. Kang Min-Jae stepped into the light, his presence solid and unhurried, cutting through the frantic, mocking energy of the room. He did not shout, yet the collective laughter of the guests died instantly, as if he had physically reached out and switched off the sound. He looked down at Zarah, not with the pity she had received from her friends, but with the quiet intensity of a man who truly saw her. "Stand up, Zarah," he said, his voice low and intelligent, carrying a weight that made Lee Dasom's earlier taunts seem like the babbling of a child. Dasom blinked, her face twisting into a performative mask of confusion. "Min-Jae, you know this girl. She's just a waitress. She's slow, she's stagnant." Min-Jae didn't look at Dasom. He looked at the room, his gaze moving with the calm, deliberate strokes of a man who was about to rearrange the truth. From the inner pocket of his coat, he produced a set of documents, the paper crisp and white against the dark marble. "You talk of provision and plans," Min-Jae said, his words falling like stones into a still pool. "You talk about who owns the future, but the walls of this penthouse know a different story." He laid the documents on a nearby table, right next to where Zarah's blood had mixed with the spilled champagne. "Years ago, when I was nothing but a shadow in this city, this woman gave me the only thing that cannot be bought, a reason to remain human. I did not forget." He turned the pages, revealing a property deed and a trust activation that silenced the tittering whispers of the crowd. "Zarah is not here because she has nowhere else to be. She is here because she chose to wait until she was truly ready. The luxury you are currently standing in, the very floor you are mocking her on, is legally hers." The room shifted. The greedy friends froze, their mouths slightly open, their carefully curated lives suddenly feeling like uncompleted buildings waiting for a foundation that would never arrive. Dasom reached for her phone, but her hand trembled, her long nails clicking uselessly against the screen. The hierarchy had not just changed. It had been turned upside down by the very patience they had called failure. Zarah stood, her emotional discipline finally meeting the hope she had sitting carefully inside her. She had nothing left to prove, and for the first time, she felt what freedom actually felt like. The transition from the service entrance to the master suite was a journey through a world Zarah had always observed but never inhabited. The golden cage of the penthouse was no longer a place where she moved like a ghost. It was her own steady sanctuary, filled with the particular kind of silence that comes with true ownership. As she walked across the marble floors she once scrubbed, the weight of the city's gaze felt different, no longer a pressure to conform, but the deep, settled satisfaction of a woman who had arrived without rushing. While Zarah's life finally had a foundation, the walls of 3 other homes in Manhattan began to echo with the sound of a performance reaching its end. Lee Dasom sat in her ivory-toned living room, the generator humming in a way that felt increasingly like a heartbeat under stress. She looked at the 5-carat diamond on her finger, realizing it was not a symbol of love, but a piece of furniture providing no warmth. The luxury she had bragged about was a house built on credit and the volatile temper of a man who occupied space like a stranger. She had provision, but in the quiet of the night, she felt the particular loneliness of a woman who had gotten exactly what she asked for and discovered it was not enough. Across town, Kim Hae-won was learning that peace without warmth was simply another word for stillness. Her marriage, built on the frantic energy of status-seeking, had become a well-maintained clock that ran on time but without feeling. Her husband's phone was always face down, and his explanations for his late arrivals were always slightly too complete. The way lies are when they have been practiced. She had cast her net wide and caught a life that shone the brightest on the outside but ached the deepest within. The greedy friends began to realize that while they were busy laughing at Zarah's slowness, they had been running toward doors that were now closing on them. They had built their plans around a man's ability to carry the weight, only to find that when the pressure came, the foundation of fear could not hold. As Zarah looked out over the zinc-colored skyline of the city, she didn't feel superior. She simply felt the freedom of a woman who had trusted herself when trusting herself was the harder choice. The friends were left to navigate the dangerous lies they had called a future, while Zarah finally breathed in a life that was entirely, completely hers. The slow, patient work of consequence finally reached Ackhafer Street on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Lee de Somme's perfect arrangement didn't end with a dramatic confrontation or the throwing of plates. It ended with the cold, mechanical sound of a door closed with just slightly too much force. As the legal authorities moved in to seize the filling stations and luxury vehicles that had formed the backbone of her status, de Somme realized that the provision she had built her life around was as fragile as the glass she had once forced Zarah to clean. She arrived at the penthouse not as a guest, but as a woman who had made her decision long before she acted on it, carrying only 2 bags and the heavy weight of her own pride. The gold-rimmed life she had bragged about had turned into a hollow arrangement where the fridge was full, but the house provided no warmth. Her husband, the man she claimed would carry the weight so she would never have to struggle, had instead left her to occupy a beautiful, empty life filled with the particular loneliness of a woman who got exactly what she asked for. Zarah made her tea and sat with her in the pale light of the penthouse, listening as the performance finally ended. "I thought provision was enough," de Somme whispered, her long nails finally silent against the cup. "I called you slow. I laughed behind your back because I was afraid of being the last one standing with nothing to show for the waiting." Zarah did not remind her of a single thing she had once said. She did not feel superior or vindicated. Instead, she stayed because staying was what de Somme needed, and Zarah had always been good at staying while everything around her moved. "You made a decision with what you knew at the time," Zarah said gently. "Now you know more. That isn't failure, de Somme. That's just living." The first domino had fallen, revealing that the slow girl they had mocked was the only one with a foundation strong enough to catch them when they fell. The unraveling of Kim Hae-won's truth arrived with a desperate, high-speed intensity that left her breathless. She arrived at the penthouse at 2 a.m, her eyes wide with the quiet devastation of someone who had paid an extremely high price for a lesson she could not return. Unlike de Somme, Hae-won did not come with bags. She came with a final, jagged manipulation, attempting to use the fine life she once bragged about as a shield against her husband's repeated betrayals. "Zarah, you have to help me," Hae-won pleaded, her voice a short, broken sound that was nothing like her usual laughter. "You and Min-Jae, you have the power. If you just speak to Desmond's associates, I can keep the apartment. I can keep the status. I just wanted the life, Zarah. I didn't think it would come with all this, sitting in a room by myself not knowing where my husband is." Zarah watched her with the quiet attention of someone who understood that Hae-won's choices were made in fear. She saw through the smooth, slightly too complete explanations. The way lies are when someone has practiced making them comfortable. Hae-won wasn't seeking a friend. She was seeking a net to catch her before she hit the floor. "I think you made peace with the wrong things, Hae-won," Zarah said, her voice sounding like everything was going to be okay, yet offering no room for further deceit. "You wanted peace so badly that you made peace with things you should have questioned." Before Hae-won could launch into another practiced defense, Kang Min-Jae stepped into the pale light of the hallway. He didn't raise his voice. He simply occupied the space with a solid, unhurried presence that rendered Hae-won's frantic energy powerless. He didn't mistreat her. He simply stood as a barrier between Zarah and the toxic desperation of a woman who still believed a man should carry the weight of her identity. "The performance is over, Hae-won," Min-Jae said simply. Hae-won looked at them, 2 people who had chosen each other with open eyes, and realized she was the last one standing with nothing to show for her waiting. Her greed had not built an empire. It had built a golden cage with no exit. Zarah stayed on the phone with her long after Min-Jae led Haewon to the door, listening to her cry in the spare room of a life she no longer owned, providing the only thing greed could never buy, someone who truly listened. The morning after the final performance of the night before, Manhattan was bathed in a pale harmattan light that filtered through the floor-to-ceiling curtains of the penthouse. Zarah lay awake, not in the frantic hurry she had once been mocked for, but in the deep, settled satisfaction of a woman who had trusted herself when trusting herself was the harder choice. Beside her, the space was no longer empty or filled with the cold stillness of a functional arrangement. It was occupied by a partnership that felt like a foundation rather than a cage. Min-Jae had not proposed with a loud, colorful introduction or a grand, performative gesture intended to silence the town. He had chosen a moment of quiet deliberation, offering a ring chosen specifically for her taste, not for show, but for the person she actually was. Their bond was built on the rare and dangerous quality of being real with one another, a life constructed without competition or the need to prove anything to the world. Zarah thought about Dasom and Haewon, who were now rebuilding their lives from the wreckage of their own fear. She did not feel superior to them, nor did she feel vindicated by their unraveling. Instead, she felt a quiet, sustaining freedom. She realized that the slowness they had laughed at, the patience they had called stagnation, had actually been her greatest weapon. It had allowed her to build an empire of her own steady self while they ran toward doors that led nowhere. As the city outside began to wake, already watching and already forming opinions, Zarah realized she no longer felt the weight of its gaze. She moved to the window, watching the sun catch the rooftops of a city that no longer felt like an audience she needed to impress. She understood now that true freedom was not found in the fine house or the 5-carat diamond, but in the presence of her own steady self within the difficulty. She had arrived exactly where she was meant to be, entirely and completely without condition. Outside, Manhattan continued its restless, frantic race, but inside the quiet walls of her own life, Zarah was finally, unshakably free. Here comes the end of the story. Subscribe, like and share.